The bank clerk's face went white as she stared at her computer screen. My daughter-in-law Jessica's smug smile melted like ice cream on hot pavement as the woman behind the counter slowly looked up at us both. "Ma'am," the clerk said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm afraid there's been some kind of mistake. According to these documents, you've just signed over full power of attorney to Mrs. Eleanor Patterson here, not the other way around." Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The color drained from her perfectly made-up face as she snatched the papers from the counter, her manicured nails nearly tearing through them as she read. Her hands were shaking so hard I thought she might drop them right there on the marble floor. "That's impossible," she whispered, then louder. "That's impossible. She signed what I gave her. I watched her do it." I just smiled. The same sweet, grandmotherly smile I'd given her 3 days ago when she'd handed me those papers and said, "Just sign here, Grandma Eleanor. It's for insurance." The same smile I'd worn as I pretended to be the confused old woman she thought I was. But I wasn't confused. I hadn't been confused for a single second. And that was the moment Jessica realized that maybe, just maybe, she'd picked the wrong grandmother to mess with. But she had no idea the worst was still to come. Let me back up and tell you how I got here. My name is Eleanor Patterson, and I'm 73 years old. Most people look at me and see exactly what Jessica saw. A sweet old lady with silver hair and reading glasses who bakes cookies for the church fundraiser and says, "Oh my," when she's surprised. What they don't see is the woman who worked her way through night school while raising 3 kids as a single mother. They don't see the woman who built a successful accounting firm from nothing but determination and a kitchen table. They don't see the woman who's been watching, listening, and planning for the past 6 months as her son's wife slowly revealed her true colors. You see, I didn't get to be 73 by being naive. I got here by being smart, careful, and always reading the fine print. It all started back in March when my son David brought Jessica home for Sunday dinner. She was 28, blonde, and had the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. David was 45 and fresh out of a messy divorce. He was lonely, vulnerable, and absolutely smitten. I knew trouble when I saw it, but I also knew my son. If I said anything against her, he'd just pull away from me. So I smiled, served pot roast, and started paying attention. The first red flag came during dessert. Jessica was asking questions, casual ones, the kind that sound like innocent interest. How long had I lived in this house? Was it paid off? Did I have any other investments besides my retirement account? Now, most people might think she was just trying to get to know the family. But I'd spent 40 years helping people manage their money, and I knew fishing expedition when I heard one. I answered with vague pleasantries and filed every question away in my mind. The second red flag came 2 weeks later. David called to tell me they were engaged. After dating for exactly 3 months. When I gently suggested maybe they should take their time getting to know each other, Jessica grabbed the phone. "Oh, Eleanor," she said in that honey-sweet voice of hers. "We just know it's right. When you find true love, you don't wait. I'm sure someone as wise as you understands that." But what I understood was the slight emphasis on wise. Like she was humoring a senile old woman. And I understood that she'd called me Eleanor instead of Mom or even Mrs. Patterson. She was marking territory, establishing distance. The third red flag was the biggest one. It came in April, right after they got married in a quickie ceremony at the courthouse. I wasn't invited. David called to apologize, said Jessica wanted something intimate, and they'd have a big party later. That party never happened, but Jessica's visits to my house sure did. She started dropping by every few days, usually with some excuse about checking on me or bringing groceries I didn't need. Each time she'd make subtle comments about how big the house was for just one person, how much work the yard must be, how I really should think about downsizing. "You know, Grandma Eleanor," she said one afternoon in May, using that fake sweet tone again, "David and I have been talking. We think you'd be so much happier in one of those nice senior living communities. Less responsibility, more friends your own age." I was watering my rose garden when she said it. I kept my face neutral, but inside, alarm bells were going off like a fire station. In my 40 years of business, I'd seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times. The young spouse who marries in quick, starts isolating the older family member, then begins the campaign to get control of their assets. "Oh, how thoughtful of you, dear," I said, not looking up from my roses. "But I'm quite happy here. This house has been my home for 35 years. Of course, she said quickly. "We just want what's best for you. David worries, you know. He says you've been forgetting things lately." That was a lie. David hadn't said any such thing because I hadn't been forgetting anything. But Jessica was laying groundwork, establishing a narrative. The confused old woman who couldn't take care of herself anymore. I decided that day that I needed to start playing chess instead of checkers. Over the next month, I began my own careful investigation. I hired a private investigator, a nice young woman named Patricia who'd done some work for me back when I was still running my firm. What she found about Jessica's past made my blood run cold. 3 previous marriages, all to older men with substantial assets. 2 had ended in messy divorces where Jessica walked away with significant settlements. The 3rd husband, a 70-year-old retired engineer named Frank, had died of what appeared to be a heart attack just 6 months after changing his will to leave everything to Jessica. The investigator couldn't prove anything suspicious about Frank's death, but the pattern was clear. Jessica was a predator who specialized in vulnerable older people and their money. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that because I was elderly, I was helpless. She'd assumed that because I baked cookies and said, "Oh my," that I couldn't see through her game. She had no idea she was dealing with someone who'd spent decades protecting people from exactly her kind of scheme. The real game began in June when David started looking tired and stressed. When I asked him about it during one of our coffee dates, he broke down and told me the truth. Jessica was pushing hard for them to move in with me, to take better care of me. She'd convinced him I needed help managing my finances and that it would be irresponsible to let me live alone much longer. "She's probably right, Mom," David said, looking miserable. "I know it's hard to admit, but you're not getting any younger. And that house is a lot for one person." My heart broke listening to him. My smart, successful son. He ran his own engineering firm, was being manipulated by someone who'd studied his guilt, his love for me, and his fear of losing another parent. She was using his good heart against him. But I couldn't tell him what I knew. Not yet. If I showed my hand too early, she'd just change tactics or disappear with whatever she could grab. No, I needed to let her think she was winning right up until the moment I took her down. So I started playing the part she expected. I began asking David to help me with little things, reading mail, understanding bills, remembering appointments. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make him worry. Jessica's eyes would light up every time I played confused, and I could practically see her calculating how much closer her plan was to working. The breakthrough came in July. Jessica suggested I should get my legal affairs in order, just to be safe. She recommended a lawyer, her lawyer, though she didn't mention that detail. She said she'd even drive me to the appointment and help me understand all the paperwork. That's when I knew she was ready to make her move. But instead of going to her lawyer, I went to mine. Thomas Hartwell had been handling my legal affairs for 20 years. He was a sharp man in his 60s who knew exactly how these scams worked. When I told him what was happening, he nodded grimly. "Eleanor, I've seen this before. Too many times. What did you have in mind?" What I had in mind was giving Jessica exactly what she thought she wanted, right up until she realized what she'd actually gotten. Thomas and I spent 2 weeks preparing. We drew up documents that looked exactly like what Jessica would expect to see. Power of attorney forms that would give her control over my finances. But hidden in the legal language, buried in subsections and clauses that looked like standard boilerplate, was a trap. Anyone who signed those papers wouldn't be gaining power of attorney over my accounts. They'd be giving me complete power of attorney over theirs. It was beautiful, elegant, and completely legal. All I needed was for Jessica to be so confident in her own cleverness that she wouldn't read what she was asking me to sign. The moment came on a Tuesday in early August. Jessica arrived at my house with a folder of papers and that same sweet smile she'd been wearing for months. "Grandma Eleanor, I have some insurance paperwork for you to sign. Nothing complicated, just routine stuff to make sure you're protected. David asked me to handle it since he knows how much you hate dealing with all that legal mumbo-jumbo." I put on my most confused expression. "Oh, insurance. I thought I already had insurance." You do, she said soothingly, pulling out the papers. "This is just additional protection. Very standard stuff. See here." She pointed to signature lines. "Just sign here, here, and here. I'll take care of the rest." I picked up my pen with slightly shaking hands. A nice touch, I thought, and pretended to squint at the papers. "Oh my, there's so much small print. Are you sure this is right?" "Absolutely," Jessica said. Her voice was patient, but I could see the excitement in her eyes. She thought she was moments away from controlling my entire financial life. "Just sign right here, and then we can go deposit these at the bank tomorrow." I signed my name in my neat, careful script. Jessica practically snatched the papers away before the ink was dry. "There," she said, her smile wide and triumphant. "All done. Was that so hard?" "No, dear," I said softly. "It wasn't hard at all." What Jessica didn't know was that Thomas had been very, very careful about one particular detail. Those weren't insurance forms. They were power of attorney documents, just like she'd intended. But the names had been switched in such a subtle way that unless you read every single word carefully, you'd never notice. She just signed away control of every asset she owned to the little old lady she thought she was scamming. The next day, she drove me to the bank just like she'd promised. She was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement, chattering about how smart it was to get these things organized, and how proud David would be that we'd taken care of everything. I just nodded and smiled, thinking about all the people like Frank who hadn't been lucky enough to see through her game. This was for them too. At the bank, Jessica walked up to the counter with complete confidence. "We need to set up some account access," she told the clerk. "I have power of attorney documents right here." The clerk, a young woman named Sarah, pulled up the information on her computer. That's when everything changed. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been some kind of mistake." And that's how Jessica discovered that the sweet old grandmother she thought she'd outsmarted had just taken control of her bank accounts, her credit cards, her car loan, and the mortgage on the little condo she owned across town. As we stood there in that bank, Jessica's face cycling through confusion, rage, and panic, I kept smiling my grandmotherly smile. But inside I was thinking about Frank, about the other men she'd preyed on, about my son who was about to learn the truth about the woman he'd married. This was just the beginning. Jessica had tried to steal my life, my home, and my security. She tried to turn my own son against me and leave me helpless in some nursing home while she spent the money I'd worked 40 years to earn. But she'd made one fatal mistake. She'd assumed that being old meant being weak. Now she was about to learn just how wrong she was. And honey, the lesson was going to hurt. Because what happened at that bank? That was just the opening move. I had plans for Jessica that would make her rue the day she ever heard the name Eleanor Patterson. But she didn't know that yet. Right now, all she knew was that her perfect scam had just blown up in her perfectly made-up face. And the real fun was just getting started. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m., jolting me from the deepest sleep I'd had in months. My hand fumbled for the receiver in the dark, my heart already racing because nobody calls with good news at that hour. "Mom!" David's voice was raw, broken in a way I'd never heard before. "Mom, I need to come over. I need to talk to you about Jessica." The line went dead, and I sat there in my dark bedroom, knowing that everything I'd worked for, everything I'd planned, was about to come crashing down around me. Because the tone in my son's voice told me that Jessica had already gotten to him first. She'd spun her story, played the victim, and now my own boy was about to take her side against his mother. But what I heard when he showed up at my door 20 minutes later wasn't what I expected at all. And it changed everything. Let me back up to earlier that day, right after we left the bank. Jessica had been silent during the drive home, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. When she pulled into my driveway, She didn't even put the car in park before she turned to me with eyes that were no longer hiding anything. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed. "You think you've won something." I looked at her with the same gentle expression I'd been wearing for months. "I'm sorry, dear, I don't understand what you mean." "Cut the act." She slammed her palm against the steering wheel. "I know what you did with those papers. I know you switched them somehow." "Oh my," I said, pressing my hand to my chest. "You're frightening me, Jessica. Maybe you should come inside and have some tea. You seem upset." For a moment I thought she might actually hit me. Her face was flushed red, and there was something wild in her eyes that reminded me of a cornered animal. But then she seemed to remember where she was, who she was supposed to be. "You're right," she said, forcing her voice back to its usual sweet tone. "I'm just stressed about work. Let's go inside and figure this out together." But I wasn't about to let her into my house. Not when she was showing her true colors. "Actually, dear, I think I need to rest. Why don't you go home and talk to David? I'm sure he can help sort out whatever confusion there is." Jessica's mask slipped again for just a second. "David doesn't need to know about this. This is between us, Eleanor." Ah, there it was. Eleanor, not Grandma Eleanor. The pretense was over. "I think my son should know about anything that concerns me," I said firmly. "After all, family shouldn't have secrets from each other. Don't you agree?" I got out of the car before she could answer, but I could feel her eyes burning into my back as I walked to my front door. I didn't look back, but I heard her car door slam and her heels clicking rapidly on my sidewalk. "This isn't over," she called out. "You made a mistake today, Eleanor. A big one." I turned around slowly, let my mask drop just a fraction. "No, dear. You made the mistake. 6 months ago, when you decided I was just another confused old lady you could steal from." The look on her face was worth every sleepless night I'd spent planning this moment. But I knew she wasn't done. Jessica was the kind of person who doubled down when cornered, and I just backed her into the smallest corner of her life. She was going to fight back, and she was going to use the one weapon she had left, my son's love for her. I spent the rest of the afternoon waiting. I made myself some lunch, tended to my rose garden, and tried to read a book, but my mind kept running through scenarios. How would she play this? What story would she tell David? Around 5 o'clock I got my answer. David's car pulled into my driveway, and I could see Jessica in the passenger seat. They both got out, but something was wrong with the picture. David looked confused, worried. Jessica looked triumphant. They walked up to my front door together, and I could see Jessica's hand on David's arm, guiding him, comforting him. My heart sank. Whatever she'd told him, he'd believed it. "Mom," David said when I opened the door. His voice was gentle but firm. "We need to talk." I invited them in, offered coffee, played the perfect hostess while my mind raced. Jessica sat close to David on my sofa, her hand never leaving his arm. She looked at me with eyes full of false concern. "Eleanor," she began, "I'm worried about you. What happened at the bank today?" "Well, David thinks you might be more confused than we realized." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. "Confused? About what?" "Mom," David said, leaning forward. "Jessica told me what happened. About the papers you signed, about how you got mixed up at the bank. She said you seemed to think the documents were something they weren't." The manipulation was beautiful in its simplicity. Jessica had turned my victory into evidence of my incompetence. In her version of events, I was the confused old woman who'd gotten paperwork mixed up, who'd somehow signed the wrong things and then created a scene at the bank when reality didn't match my adult expectations. "I think," Jessica said softly, "that maybe it's time to seriously consider getting you some help. Someone to manage these kinds of things for you. It's not your fault, Eleanor. This happens to everyone as they get older." David nodded, his face full of love and worry. "Mom, you know I'd never want to take away your independence. But if you're having trouble with documents and legal papers..." "I'm not confused," I said quietly. "Of course you don't think you are," Jessica said with practiced patience. That's part of the problem. People with cognitive decline rarely realize it's happening. I looked at my son. My smart, successful son who built bridges and solved complex engineering problems, and watched him nod along with this manipulative woman's lies. She'd played him perfectly, used his love for me against both of us. That's when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't let her build this narrative that would end with me in some facility while she drained my accounts and convinced David it was all for my own good. David, I said, standing up, I need to show you something. I walked to my desk and pulled out a manila folder I'd been saving for exactly this moment. Inside were copies of everything Patricia had uncovered about Jessica's past. The previous marriages, the suspicious death, the financial settlements. All of it documented and verified. What's this? David asked, taking the folder. The truth about your wife. Jessica went very still beside him. Eleanor, what are you talking about? I'm talking about Frank Morrison, your third husband. The one who died of a heart attack 6 months after he married you and left you his entire estate. David looked up from the papers, his face pale. Mom, what is this? I'm talking about Harold Chan and Robert Walsh, your first 2 husbands. Both wealthy older men. Both of whom lost significant assets to you in divorce settlements. David, Jessica said quickly. She's making things up. This is exactly what I was talking about. The confusion, the paranoia. It's getting worse. But David was reading now, really reading. And I could see the exact moment when he started to understand what he was looking at. These are police reports, he said slowly. Court documents. Financial records. I hired an investigator, I said. 6 months ago, when I first started noticing Jessica's unusual interest in my assets. My assets. Jessica laughed, but it sounded forced. David, I've never asked your mother for money. This is all in her head. Then explain the power of attorney documents, I said calmly. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. David was staring at her with an expression I'd never seen before, like he was looking at a complete stranger. What power of attorney documents? He asked. Jessica's face had gone white. David, I can explain. The ones she brought me today, I continued. The ones she told me were insurance forms. The ones that would have given her complete control over my financial accounts if I'd actually signed them. But you said she was confused about paperwork, David said to Jessica. His voice was deadly quiet. You said she mixed up documents. She did. David, please let me explain. Explain what? His voice was rising now. Explain why you lied to me about everything. Explain why you tried to steal from my mother. Explain why you've been married 3 times before and never mentioned it. Jessica stood up abruptly. I don't have to listen to this. Your mother is obviously having some kind of breakdown, making up stories. The stories are all documented, I said. Court records don't lie, Jessica. Neither do death certificates or financial statements. That's when she snapped. You stupid old bitch, she screamed. You think you're so smart. You think you've won. You have no idea what you've done. David was on his feet now, staring at her like he'd never seen her before. Jessica! Shut up, she yelled at him. Just shut up. You're as pathetic as she is. A middle-aged mama's boy who can't see what's right in front of his face. The mask was completely off now. This was Jessica without the sweet voice, without the fake concern, without the careful manipulation. This was the predator who'd been circling my family for months. Get out, David said quietly. What? Get out of my mother's house. Get out now. Jessica looked between us, and I could see her mind working, trying to figure out if there was still a play to be made, still a way to salvage this. But David's face was stone, and I was looking at her with the expression of someone who just won a very long, very careful game of chess. This isn't over, she said to me. You think you're clever, but you have no idea who you're messing with. Actually, I said calmly, I know exactly who I'm messing with. The question is whether you know who you were messing with. She left then, slamming the door so hard that my grandmother's china rattled in the cabinet. David and I sat in silence for a long time after that. Finally, he looked at me with eyes full of hurt and confusion. "Mom, why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me if I had? Before tonight?" He was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "No, probably not. She's very good at what she does, honey. She's had a lot of practice. I feel so stupid." "You're not stupid. You fell in love with someone who turned out to be playing a part. That doesn't make you stupid. It makes you human." We talked until almost midnight. I showed him everything. All the documents, all the evidence, all the careful planning I'd done to protect us both. He was angry at Jessica, angry at himself, and somehow proud of me all at the same time. "I can't believe you outmaneuvered her like that," he said. "The power of attorney switch. That was brilliant. I had a good teacher. 40 years in accounting teaches you to read the fine print." He hugged me then, really hugged me like he used to when he was little and scared. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I didn't see it. The important thing is that you see it now." But as David drove away that night, I knew this wasn't over. Jessica had made threats, and women like her didn't make empty threats. She'd lost this battle, but she hadn't lost the war. That's when the phone rang at 2:47 a.m. "Mom." David's voice was broken, desperate. "Mom, I need to come over. I need to talk to you about Jessica." When he showed up at my door 20 minutes later, he was holding a piece of paper in his shaking hands. His face was white as a sheet, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years since I'd seen him just a few hours earlier. "She's gone," he said simply. "She cleaned out our joint checking account, took her stuff and left." "But Mom." He held up the paper. "She left this." It was a note, written in Jessica's careful handwriting. "Eleanor thinks she's won, but this is just the beginning. Tell your mother that some games have consequences she never imagined. She wanted to play chess. Fine. But I play for keeps and I play to destroy. This isn't over until I say it's over. Jay." David looked at me with fear in his eyes. "Mom, what does this mean? What is she going to do?" I took the note from his hands and read it again. Jessica wasn't just angry about losing the money. She was furious about being outplayed by someone she'd underestimated. And that made her dangerous in ways I was only beginning to understand. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But we're going to find out together." What I didn't tell him was that I'd already started getting strange phone calls earlier that evening. Hang-ups mostly, but once I'd heard breathing on the other end before the line went dead. And when I'd looked out my window around 11 o'clock, I could have sworn I'd seen a car parked across the street with someone sitting inside. Jessica wasn't just gone. She was still out there planning something. And whatever it was going to be worse than anything she'd tried so far. Because now it wasn't just about money. Now it was personal. The real war was about to begin, and I had a sinking feeling that my little victory at the bank had just painted a target on my back that I might not be smart enough to get out from under. But I'd protected my family once. Somehow I was gonna have to do it again. The only question was, what was Jessica planning, and would I figure it out before it was too late? The sound of sirens woke me at dawn, and my first thought was that Jessica had finally made her move. I stumbled to my front window, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw 3 police cars in my driveway and officers walking around my rose garden with cameras. That's when I noticed the smell. Gasoline, heavy and sharp in the morning air. And that's when I saw what they were photographing. Someone had poured gasoline all around my house during the night, soaking the foundation, the bushes, everything. If they'd lit a match, I would have been burned alive in my sleep. But the gasoline wasn't the worst part. Spray painted across my front door in blood-red letters were the words, "Last warning, old lady." The police officer at my door was young, probably in his 20s, with kind eyes that were trying hard to look professional. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Martinez. We got a call from your neighbor about suspicious activity. Can you tell me if you have any idea who might want to do this?" I could tell him exactly who had done this. But I also knew that without proof, it would just be my word against Jessica's. And she'd proven very good at making me look like a confused old woman. But what I didn't expect was what happened next. Because this wasn't just about Jessica anymore. This was about something much bigger and much more dangerous. Let me back up to the previous evening, after David left with that threatening note. I tried to go to bed, but every little sound had me jumping. The house settling, the wind in the trees, a cat yowling somewhere in the neighborhood. It all sounded like someone trying to break in. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and made myself some chamomile tea. I was sitting in my kitchen when I heard a car door slam outside. Not unusual for my neighborhood, but something made me get up and peek through the curtains. There was a dark sedan parked across the street, and I could see two figures moving around outside it. They were too far away for me to make out details, but something about their movements was deliberate, purposeful. They weren't just visitors arriving late. They were watching my house. I turned off all the lights and moved to my living room window, where I had a better view. One of the figures was definitely a woman. I could tell by her silhouette. The other was taller, broader. Man. They stood there for maybe 10 minutes just looking at my house. Then the woman pointed toward my front door, and they both started walking across the street. That's when I called 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Eleanor Patterson at 1247 Maple Street. There are two people on my property who don't belong here. I think they're trying to break in. Are you in a safe location, ma'am? I'm inside my house, but they're in my yard now. Units are on the way. Stay on the line with me. I crept back to the window, but the figures were gone. I couldn't see them anywhere, and that was somehow worse than watching them. Where had they gone? Were they at my back door? Were they trying windows? The police arrived 6 minutes later. I timed it. But by then, whoever had been there was long gone. The officers walked around my property, checked all the doors and windows, found nothing disturbed. Sometimes kids play pranks, one of them told me. Or maybe it was just someone who got lost and was looking for an address. If it happens again, call us right back. They were nice enough, but I could see they thought I was just a nervous old lady jumping at shadows. They had no way of knowing about Jessica, about the threats, about the careful campaign of terror that I was pretty sure was just beginning. After they left, I double-checked all my locks and tried to convince myself that maybe it had been nothing. Maybe it was kids or lost visitors, or just my imagination running wild after the stress of the day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica had been out there, watching, planning whatever came next. I must have finally fallen asleep around 4 a.m., because that's the last time I remember looking at the clock. Which meant I'd been asleep for less than 2 hours when the sirens woke me. Now I was standing in my driveway in my bathrobe and slippers, watching police officers photograph evidence of what could have been my murder. Ma'am. Officer Martinez was still waiting for an answer. Do you know anyone who might want to threaten you? Before I could answer, another car pulled up, an unmarked sedan with two people in suits. Detectives, I realized. This was more serious than I'd thought. The woman who got out was in her 40s. Tall and athletic with short dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. Her partner was older, probably close to retirement, with a kind of face that had seen everything and wasn't surprised by much anymore. Mrs. Patterson. I'm Detective Sarah Webb. This is Detective Frank Russo. We'd like to ask you some questions about what happened here. We sat in my living room while they took notes. I told them about Jessica, about the failed power of attorney scheme, about the threatening note she'd left. Detective Webb wrote everything down while Detective Russo studied my face like he was trying to decide if I was telling the truth. Do you have this note with you? Webb asked. My son has it. David Patterson. He lives about 20 minutes away. We'll need to see it. And we'll need contact information for Jessica. That's when I realized I didn't actually have much contact information for Jessica. I knew she lived in a condo across town, but I didn't have an address. I knew she had a car, but I didn't know what kind or what license plate. For someone who'd been planning to steal my life, she'd been remarkably careful about not leaving me much to trace her with. What's her last name? Russo asked. Patterson. She married my son. But I don't know what her maiden name was. The detectives exchanged a look. How long have they been married? About 4 months. Another look between them and I started to get a bad feeling. Mrs. Patterson, Webb said carefully, when you hired this private investigator to look into Jessica's background, did she give you copies of marriage certificates? Yes, she did. For the previous marriages. But not for her marriage to your son. Thought about that. Patricia had given me documentation of Jessica's 3 previous marriages, but come to think of it, I'd never actually seen proof that she was legally married to David. Just assumed. I don't think she did, I said slowly. But they had a ceremony. David told me they went to the courthouse. Webb and Russo looked at each other again, and this time I could read the look. They'd found something I wasn't going to like. Mrs. Patterson, what's your son's full legal name? David Michael Patterson. And you said Jessica told you her name was Jessica Patterson now? Yes, that's right. Webb pulled out her phone and made a quick call. She spoke quietly, but I caught enough to understand that she was running a search for marriage records. After a few minutes,